Nobody expected suburban mothers with spiral notebooks and scissors to outsmart the entire banking industry. But in kitchens across America throughout the 1980s, while financial advisors were charging fees to explain compound interest, women were quietly building systems that would carry their families through recessions, layoffs, and inflation spikes that made economists nervous. These weren't tricks you'd find in any investment brochure. They were survival strategies perfected at Formica countertops under fluorescent lights, passed between neighbors in checkout lines, refined through years of making $30 stretch across 7 dinners. And the most remarkable part? The banks never wanted you to know any of it. The 1980s arrived with a financial punch that most families weren't prepared for. Mortgage rates climbed past 13%, then kept climbing. Grocery prices that had felt stable for years suddenly jumped 20, 30, sometimes 40% on staples families couldn't live without. A gallon of milk that cost $1.99 in 1979 was pushing past $2.50 by 1981. Ground beef, bread, eggs, everything was rising, and paychecks weren't keeping pace. Financial experts on the evening news talked about inflation rates and economic indicators, but in real homes with real kids who needed real lunches packed every morning, those terms meant nothing. What mattered was the gap between what you earned on Friday and what you owed by Monday. That's when mothers across the country stopped waiting for the economy to fix itself. They stopped trusting that things would get better if they just held on a little longer. Instead, they built something banks had never quite figured out how to sell. A system that worked regardless of what interest rates were doing, regardless of what the stock market did yesterday, regardless of whether your husband's company was talking about cutbacks. These systems didn't require a financial advisor or a business degree. They required something much harder to teach: the ability to see 6 moves ahead while standing in aisle 3 of the Piggly Wiggly with a calculator, a stack of coupons, and $17 left until payday. If you found this video helpful, kindly share it with your family and loved ones. Also like our video, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel. We make this type of content daily, and please tell us in the comments where you're from and which type of video you like most, so we make next video on that topic. Walk into almost any middle-class kitchen in 1982, and you'd find the evidence tucked into drawers and cupboards. Envelopes sorted by category: groceries, utilities, gas, school supplies, each containing exact amounts of cash withdrawn every Friday afternoon. A composition notebook with columns drawn in ballpoint pen, tracking every purchase down to the penny. Shoeboxes filled with clipped coupons organized by expiration date, store, and product category. These weren't the tools of poverty. These were the weapons of women who understood that financial security wasn't about how much you made. It was about how much you kept, how far you stretched it, and how invisible you made the effort look. The grocery store became a battlefield where these moms waged quiet war against inflation. They studied weekly circulars the way generals studied maps, identifying loss leader items, the deliberately underpriced products stores used to lure customers inside. While other shoppers grabbed what they needed and left, these women were executing sophisticated strategies. They knew which stores rotated sales on canned goods, which chains offered double coupon days, which managers marked down meat at exactly 6 o'clock Tuesday evenings. They understood markdown schedules better than most stockbrokers understood the market, and they used that knowledge ruthlessly. But the real genius wasn't in the couponing itself. Plenty of people clipped coupons. The difference was in the system, the way these mothers turned scattered savings into mathematical certainty. Every Sunday morning, before church or during it, depending on the family, the week's grocery circulars got spread across the kitchen table. Coupons came out, a master list formed, not of what the family wanted, but of where value intersected with need. If chicken was on sale at Kroger, but green beans were cheapest at A&P, the route got planned. If a coupon for 50 cents off tomato sauce could be doubled at one store but not another, that decided the trip. These weren't errands. These were military operations designed to extract maximum value from minimum dollars. The envelope system was perhaps the most powerful tool these mothers had, and it was so simple that financial institutions completely missed its importance. Every Friday, or whenever payday landed, the paycheck got cashed. Not deposited, cashed. Banks wanted your money in their accounts, earning them interest while paying you almost nothing. These moms wanted their money in their hands, visible and divided. The cash went into labeled envelopes immediately. Once the grocery envelope was empty, you stopped buying groceries. Once the gas envelope was done, you combined trips or stayed home. The system was harsh, but it was honest. A checkbook could lie to you, could let you pretend you had more than you did until the overdraft notice arrived. Cash told the truth every single time. What made these women so effective wasn't just their methods, it was their mentality. They operated with a level of financial discipline that would have impressed any accountant, but they did it without the vocabulary, without the degrees, without anyone telling them they were doing something remarkable. They simply understood bone deep that nobody was coming to save them. No government program, no raise that would fix everything, no lottery ticket or inheritance. Security came from what they did with their own two hands, week after week, year after year. And so they did it. Inside their pantries, you could see the evidence of this long-term thinking. Rows of canned goods purchased when prices dipped, enough to carry through until the next sales cycle. Bulk rice and pasta bought at warehouse stores, portioned into smaller containers. Freezers stocked with marked-down meat, rewrapped and labeled with purchase dates. These pantries weren't about hoarding or paranoia. They were about creating stability in an unstable economy, about building a buffer between your family and whatever came next. When your neighbor got laid off, when your own hours got cut, when the car needed $400 of repairs you didn't expect, that pantry meant you kept eating, kept functioning, kept your dignity intact. The banks, meanwhile, were selling something entirely different. They wanted you to believe security came from their products, savings accounts with laughable interest rates, certificates of deposit that locked your money away, loans that seemed helpful until you calculated what you actually paid back. They had marble lobbies and air conditioning and men in suits who spoke confidently about your financial future. But they didn't have systems that worked when you had 3 kids, a mortgage, and $60 to feed everyone for the next week. They didn't have answers for what happens when both parents are working full-time and you're still choosing between fixing the washing machine and buying winter coats. So mothers stopped asking banks for answers and started finding their own. These women taught their children differently than previous generations had. Money wasn't a taboo subject whispered about behind closed doors. It was math, practiced at the kitchen table, visible and real. Kids learned to calculate unit prices before they learned long division in school. They understood that name brands and store brands often came from the same factory with different labels. They knew why you bought birthday presents in July when they were on clearance, not in December when desperation made you careless. This wasn't about raising cheap children. It was about raising children who understood value, who wouldn't be fooled by marketing, who would know the difference between price and cost. And those lessons would carry forward in ways that no one fully understood yet. But here's what nobody talks about when they romanticize the 1980s. How exhausting this level of vigilance actually was. How much mental energy it required to track 6 different stores' sales cycles while also working, raising children, managing a household. How it felt to do everything right, to follow your own system perfectly and still come up short because wages stayed flat while everything else climbed. These women were brilliant, resourceful, and relentless. They were also tired in ways that didn't show up in family photos. And yet they kept going, kept refining their systems, kept finding new ways to stretch impossibly thin resources across expanding needs. Because the alternative, giving up, spending blindly, hoping for the best, wasn't really an alternative at all. The notebook entries tell the story better than any financial report could. January 8th, groceries, $42.16. January 10th, gas, $12 even. January 14th, school supplies, $6.73. Line after line, month after month, year after year, every purchase accounted for, every dollar tracked. These weren't the habits of people living in fear. These were the habits of people who understood that financial peace didn't come from having more. It came from knowing exactly where everything went and making conscious choices about where it would go next. And somewhere in all of this, between the coupon organizing and the envelope stuffing and the price book updating, these mothers built something that banks, with all their resources and experts and technology, never quite managed to replicate. They built certainty, not wealth, not luxury, but the solid knowledge that they would be okay, that their families would eat and the lights would stay on and the bills would get paid. That certainty didn't come from a portfolio or an investment strategy. It came from systems so practical and so powerful that they worked in any economy, under any circumstances, for anyone disciplined enough to use them. But the question nobody was asking in those kitchen table war rooms was the most important one of all. If these methods were so effective, if they protected families through genuine economic hardship, why weren't banks teaching them? Why weren't financial advisors recommending envelope systems and price books and strategic shopping? The answer was about to become painfully clear. What the banking industry understood, but never quite said out loud, was that financially independent customers were terrible customers. A family that operated on cash, tracked every penny, and planned 6 months ahead didn't need loans for unexpected expenses, didn't carry credit card balances at 18% interest, didn't pay overdraft fees or late charges. The methods that made 1980s mothers financially secure made them financially useless to an industry built on interest, fees, and people who were just a little bit desperate, just a little bit behind. So while these women were perfecting systems that actually worked, banks were perfecting systems that kept you coming back, kept you paying, kept you just dependent enough. The genius of what these mothers built went far beyond couponing, though couponing was certainly part of it. The real sophistication showed up in how they thought about food, not meal to meal or even week to week, but in cycles that matched sale patterns and seasonal availability. A mother who'd been running her system for 3 or 4 years could tell you without looking at a calendar that ground beef went on deep discount every 6 weeks at Kroger, that whole chickens dropped to 49 cents a pound every other month at Safeway, that canned vegetables hit rock-bottom prices twice a year, usually in March and October. She didn't need apps or algorithms. She had something better: years of careful observation and a memory sharpened by necessity. This knowledge transformed how they cooked. Meals weren't planned around cravings or convenience. They were architectural projects built on a foundation of what was cheap right now and what was already stockpiled in the pantry. When pork chops went on sale, you bought enough for 8 meals, not 1. You froze them in sets of 4. 2 dinners now, 2 dinners 6 weeks from now, when prices would be high again. When tomato sauce was 2 cans for $1, you bought 20 cans because you knew it would be back up to 69 cents each next month. This wasn't hoarding or extreme couponing for television. This was treating your pantry like a bank account, depositing value when it was abundant so you could withdraw it when it was scarce. The stretch meal strategy was perhaps the most creative element of their systems. A whole chicken purchased for $3 on Tuesday didn't become just one dinner. In the hands of a practiced 1980s mother, that chicken became 4 or 5 meals, each one satisfying enough that no one felt deprived. Day 1 was roasted chicken with vegetables. Day 2 was chicken sandwiches with the leftover meat. Day 3 was chicken soup, the carcass boiled down with whatever vegetables were aging in the crisper drawer, served with crackers or cornbread. Day 4 might be chicken pot pie, stretching those last bits of meat with a can of cream of mushroom soup and frozen mixed vegetables. By the time that $3 chicken was finished working, it had fed a family of 4 for nearly a week. That's not poverty cooking. That's understanding value at a molecular level. Shopping became a carefully choreographed performance. These women didn't wander aisles hoping for inspiration. They moved with purpose, lists in hand, calculator ready, comparing unit prices with the speed of card counters in Vegas. They knew that the 16-ounce jar wasn't always cheaper than 2 8-ounce jars, especially with coupons involved. They knew that eye-level shelves held the expensive brands while better values hid near the floor or above normal sight lines. They knew that end cap displays weren't necessarily sales. They were premium placement that manufacturers paid for, often at regular prices. They knew all of this because they'd made it their business to know, because not knowing cost money their families didn't have. But perhaps the most subversive element of their approach was how they treated store loyalty programs before store loyalty programs really existed. These mothers understood that grocery stores operated on thin margins and used a handful of items as loss leaders, products sold below cost to drive traffic. They had no loyalty to any particular store. They were loyal only to value. If that meant shopping at 3 different stores in one trip, that's what happened. The car seat held milk crates with each store's purchases separated, coupons pre-organized for destination. It wasn't uncommon for a serious shopping day to involve hitting Kroger for loss leader ground beef, then A&P for double coupon redemption on canned goods, then the local discount grocer for produce. This was shopping as sport, as strategy, as serious business. What outsiders didn't understand was how much math was involved. These women were doing complex calculations in their heads constantly. Unit price comparisons, coupon value optimization, sales cycle predictions, inventory management. A typical shopping trip involved hundreds of micro decisions, each one affecting the household budget by small amounts that added up to enormous differences over time. Was it worth driving an extra 3 miles to save 40 cents on milk? Depends on gas prices and what else that store had on sale. Should you buy 12 boxes of pasta at 60 cents each, even though you only need 2? Absolutely, if you have the storage space and the cash envelope allows it, because next month they'll be 89 cents again. This was mathematical literacy at its finest, applied to real-world problems with immediate consequences. The hidden swap systems these mothers used deserve their own recognition. Baby clothes, toys, small appliances, even furniture. Nothing got purchased new if it could be acquired used. But this wasn't random garage sale shopping. These were organized networks of mothers who traded and swapped and passed items through a community pipeline with remarkable efficiency. Your kids outgrew their winter coats. Those coats went to the neighbor whose kids were one size smaller. And when your kids needed the next size up, different neighbors had you covered. Birthday parties involved gifts that had been purchased on clearance throughout the year, stashed in closets until needed. School supplies bought during August clearance sales in bulk, shared among families. These networks operated on trust and reciprocity, creating a shadow economy where need and surplus balanced each other out without money changing hands. Emergency funds existed, but not in savings accounts. Banks paid maybe 5% interest if you were lucky, and that was before fees and minimum balance requirements. These mothers kept their emergency money in different forms. Cash in actual hiding places around the house, yes, but also in strategic stockpiles of non-perishable goods. In tools and equipment purchased used but kept pristine. In skills they'd cultivated that could generate income quickly. When crisis hit, and it always did eventually, they had resources that didn't require asking a bank for permission to access their own money. The washing machine died on Thursday. There was cash in the envelope marked repairs. Husband got laid off. The pantry held 3 months of food, the freezer another month beyond that. This wasn't paranoia. This was planning. What made these systems revolutionary wasn't their individual components. Coupons had existed before. Budgets had existed before. What was revolutionary was the integration. The way these mothers took a dozen different strategies and wove them into a comprehensive system that addressed every aspect of household finance. And they did it without books or courses or consultants. They did it through conversation and observation and trial and error. They taught each other in grocery store lines and at PTA meetings and over coffee at kitchen tables. This was distributed knowledge, crowdsourced before crowdsourcing had a name, and it was remarkably effective. The psychological discipline required was perhaps the hardest part, and the part banks understood least. Financial institutions assumed people wanted to spend, that restriction felt like punishment, that given the opportunity, everyone would choose immediate gratification. But these mothers operated from a different mindset entirely. They'd seen what happened when you spent first and planned later. They'd watched neighbors lose houses, families fracture under financial stress, children suffer not from lack of love, but from lack of resources. So they made different choices, day after day, year after year. They walked past impulse items without a second glance. They said no to their kids when no was necessary, and explained why in terms those kids could understand. They deferred wants in service of needs with a consistency that bordered on superhuman. And their kids were watching, learning lessons that schools didn't teach. They saw their mothers clip coupons and understood that preparation today meant security tomorrow. They watched their parents say no to restaurant meals and yes to family dinners at home, and learned that time together mattered more than convenience. They helped sort coupons and compared prices, and counted cash into envelopes, and absorbed financial literacy through osmosis. These children grew up understanding something fundamental that many Americans never learned, that true wealth isn't about how much you have, it's about how secure you feel with what you've got. But here's what nobody acknowledged then and barely acknowledges now. These mothers were doing work that deserved professional recognition. They were CFOs of small organizations, their households, managing complex budgets, optimizing resource allocation, forecasting needs, mitigating risks, all without compensation or acknowledgement. They were doing it so well that their families weathered economic storms that devastated others. They were so good at making it look easy that everyone assumed it was, that anyone could do it, that it didn't require intelligence or skill or relentless effort, but it did require all those things and more. And then something interesting started happening as the 1980s progressed. The systems these mothers built began showing results that even they hadn't fully anticipated. Families that had felt one paycheck away from disaster started building actual cushions. Emergency funds grew from $200 hidden in coffee cans to $1,000, then $2,000. Some families paid off cars early. A few paid off houses years ahead of schedule. These weren't high earners gaming tax codes. These were regular families in regular houses doing something extraordinary. They were winning a game that most people didn't even realize they were playing. The banks noticed, but not in the way you'd hope. They noticed that certain demographics were becoming less profitable, that some neighborhoods showed declining interest in credit products, that their most reliable revenue streams, families living slightly beyond their means, paying minimum monthly charges on everything, were drying up in pockets across the country. But instead of studying what these families were doing right, instead of learning from these systems and teaching them to others, banks doubled down on what made them money. They created new fee structures, new loan products, new ways to keep people dependent. Because a financially independent customer was still a terrible customer, no matter how good it was for that family. What these mothers had discovered, though they might not have phrased it this way, was that the financial industry's interests and their families' interests were not aligned. Banks prospered when you carried balances, made minimum payments, needed loans for emergencies. Families prospered when they paid cash, avoided debt, and planned ahead. These were fundamentally opposing strategies. And for a few years in the 1980s, in kitchens across America, Families were quietly choosing their own prosperity over the financial industry's profit margins. The question was whether that knowledge would survive into the next generation, or whether convenience and credit would eventually win. What nobody tells you about revolution is how quietly it ends. These 1980s mothers, with their envelope systems and price books and pantry strategies, weren't just managing household budgets. They were operating outside a financial system designed to keep them dependent. And for a while, for one bright decade, they were winning. Their families were stable when neighbors were struggling. Their children were fed when inflation should have made that impossible. Their emergency funds grew while credit card companies sent increasingly desperate mailers. But revolutions that threaten profit margins rarely survive contact with the next generation, especially when an entire industry has billions of reasons to make sure they don't. The legacy should have been ironclad. These women raised children at those kitchen tables, children who watched every coupon get clipped, every envelope get filled, every dollar get accounted for. Those kids learned to calculate unit prices before they learned algebra. They understood delayed gratification not as a concept, but as a daily practice. They saw their mothers turn $3 into a week's worth of meals and learned that scarcity plus creativity equals survival. Everything was in place for this knowledge to transfer seamlessly from one generation to the next. But knowledge transfer requires more than just observation. It requires a world that values what's being taught. And the world that emerged in the 1990s had very different plans. Credit became the great eraser of discipline. When these 1980s kids grew up and got their first apartments, their first real jobs, their mailboxes filled with pre-approved credit card offers. Not the cautious, limited cards their parents might have carried for emergencies. These were cards with $5,000, $10,000 limits, offered to 22-year-olds with no credit history and entry-level salaries. The pitch was seductive and everywhere. You deserve this now. You've worked hard. You shouldn't have to wait. Everyone else is living this way. And slowly, then rapidly, the lessons learned at kitchen tables began competing with messages designed by marketing departments with unlimited budgets and psychological research on their side. The banks noticed, but not in the way you'd hope. They noticed that certain demographics were becoming less profitable. That some neighborhoods showed declining interest in credit products, that their most reliable revenue streams, families living slightly beyond their means, paying minimum monthly charges on everything, were drying up in pockets across the country. But instead of studying what these families were doing right, instead of learning from these systems and teaching them to others, banks doubled down on what made them money. They created new fee structures, new loan products, new ways to keep people dependent. Because a financially independent customer was still a terrible customer, no matter how good it was for that family. What these mothers had discovered, though they might not have phrased it this way, was that the financial industry's interests and their families' interests were not aligned. Banks prospered when you carried balances, made minimum payments, needed loans for emergencies. Families prospered when they paid cash, avoided debt, and planned ahead. These were fundamentally opposing strategies. And for a few years in the 1980s, in kitchens across America, families were quietly choosing their own prosperity over the financial industry's profit margins. The question was whether that knowledge would survive into the next generation, or whether convenience and credit would eventually win. Convenience became the enemy of savings in ways those 1980s mothers would have found bewildering. Prepared foods, takeout meals, subscription services for everything from movies to razors. Each one cost more, but promised time savings that two exhausted working parents couldn't refuse. The microwave dinner cost 3 times what cooking from scratch would cost, but it was ready in 5 minutes, and nobody had energy left at 8 p.m. to do anything more complicated. Those Sunday afternoon coupon sorting sessions, They competed with youth sports schedules and weekend work emails and the exhaustion of modern life. The old ways still worked, but using them required resources, time, energy, mental bandwidth that felt increasingly scarce. And the banks? The financial institutions that had quietly resented those envelope-carrying, cash-using, interest-avoiding mothers? They got exactly what they'd always wanted. The average American household now carries over $8,000 in credit card debt. Overdraft fees generate billions in annual revenue. Personal loans, payday advances, buy now, pay later schemes, an entire ecosystem evolved to catch people who didn't have the systems those 1980s mothers built. The industry that had been sidelined by disciplined households found a new generation that managed money the way banks preferred, reactively, emotionally, always a little bit behind, always paying fees and interest for the privilege of staying slightly afloat. But here's what makes the loss of this knowledge so tragic. It wasn't inevitable. The methods those mothers used weren't dependent on the 1980s. They worked in the 1930s, they worked in the 1980s, and they work now for the families disciplined enough to use them. Cash envelopes function identically whether you're budgeting $30 a week for groceries or $300. Price comparison matters whether you're buying canned beans or organic quinoa. The pantry strategy of buying low and consuming later works for any product in any decade. These weren't period-specific tricks, they were timeless principles applied practically. What changed wasn't the validity of the methods. What changed was the culture's willingness to do what worked instead of what felt easy. You can still find them, though, the inheritors of that knowledge, scattered across the country in surprising places. The family earning $40,000 a year with more genuine security than their neighbors earning $90,000. The young couple who paid off their house in 7 years while friends are refinancing for the third time. The single mother feeding 3 kids on a budget that shouldn't be possible, using systems her grandmother taught her. They're not common, and they're often invisible because financial discipline doesn't broadcast itself the way financial stress does. But they exist. Proof that the methods still work for anyone willing to learn them. What those remaining practitioners understand is something the financial industry hopes you never figure out. Consumer debt is almost always optional. Not poverty. That's a different beast entirely. Structural and brutal and not solved by budgeting. But the middle-class financial anxiety, the paycheck-to-paycheck existence despite good incomes, the constant low-grade panic about money that characterizes modern life for millions, that's largely constructed by choices that feel mandatory but aren't. Those 1980s mothers knew this. They lived in a world that was also trying to sell them convenience and status and immediate gratification. They just said no more consistently, more deliberately, with clearer understanding of what they were protecting. The wisdom they embodied wasn't complicated. Track everything. Spend intentionally. Distinguish between wants and needs. Plan ahead. Build buffers. Avoid bet except for appreciating assets. Make decisions based on your actual financial reality rather than your hoped-for future reality. None of this requires a finance degree. None of it requires high income. It requires something simultaneously simpler and harder. The willingness to swim against cultural currents that insist you deserve everything now, that waiting is for suckers, that if you can make the monthly payment, you can afford the purchase. Their children and grandchildren are rediscovering these lessons, often the hard way. The 2008 financial crisis taught some families what 1980s inflation taught an earlier generation, that the system isn't designed to protect you, that security comes from what you build yourself, that the gap between income and spending is the only number that really matters. The pandemic taught others, as job losses and economic chaos revealed which households had genuine reserves and which had been running on fumes and optimism. Each crisis creates a new cohort of people ready to hear what those envelope-carrying mothers could have told them decades ago. What makes this moment different is that the knowledge is no longer just passed kitchen table to kitchen table. It's being documented, shared, preserved in ways that weren't possible before. Someone explains the envelope system on social media and a million people see it. Someone shares their grandmother's price book method and it spreads globally in hours. The knowledge that was once localized, transmitted only within families and communities, is now accessible to anyone with internet access and the humility to learn from the past. The question is whether our culture will value it, whether we'll choose the harder path that leads to actual security over the easier path that leads to prettier Instagram posts. Banks still don't teach these methods, and they never will. They can't make money on customers who don't need their products. They can't profit from families who have eliminated financial anxiety through discipline and planning. The entire financial services industry is built on people who are slightly desperate, slightly behind, slightly hoping that the next loan or credit card or investment will finally solve their problems. A family operating on 1980s mom principles doesn't need solving. They've already solved it themselves. The tragedy is that this knowledge was almost lost entirely, that an entire generation of mothers perfected systems that could have protected millions of families, but most of that wisdom evaporated in the cultural shift toward credit and convenience and consumption. The hope is that enough pieces survived, scattered across families and communities and now the internet, that we might rebuild what was almost forgotten. Because the next economic crisis is always coming, the next inflation spike, the next disruption that exposes which households built their lives on solid foundations and which built on sand and wishful thinking. Those 1980s mothers, the ones who sat at Formica countertops, filling envelopes and clipping coupons and making impossible budgets work through sheer discipline and creativity, they weren't just managing their own households. They were protecting their families from an economic system designed to extract maximum value from everyone caught in it. They were teaching their children that security doesn't come from income level, it comes from the gap between what you earn and what you spend. They were proving every single day that financial peace is available to anyone willing to do the work, track the numbers, make the hard choices, and ignore the cultural messages insisting that deprivation is the same as discipline. Their notebooks are probably gone now, those spiral-bound ledgers with years of entries tracking every dollar. Their envelope systems were likely abandoned when debit cards became standard. Their price books and coupon organizers ended up in estate sales, curiosities from a different era that the buyers probably didn't understand. But the principles those tools represented are immortal because they're based on mathematics and human nature, and neither of those has changed. Spend less than you earn, plan ahead, track everything, build reserves, avoid debt, distinguish wants from needs, teach your children by example. This wasn't rocket science. It was something harder, consistent application of boring principles that work day after day, year after year, regardless of what the economy does. If you're looking for permission to live differently than the consumption-driven culture insists you should, consider it granted by every mother who made it work when the deck was stacked against her. If you're wondering whether the old ways still work in modern times, they do. The families using them are just too busy living within their means to broadcast it. And if you're hoping for a system that offers real security in genuinely uncertain times, you don't need to wait for banks to teach it to you. You just need a notebook, some envelopes, the discipline to track what you spend, and the courage to make decisions based on reality rather than hope. Those 1980s moms didn't just survive tough economic times. They built systems so robust that their families thrived when others were drowning. And they did it without anyone's permission, without fancy tools, without waiting for circumstances to improve. They simply decided that financial peace mattered more than financial appearance, and they acted on that decision every single day. That wisdom is still available, still powerful, still waiting for anyone ready to use it. The question is whether you'll be one of the ones who does. If you want more forgotten budget wisdom from the generations who perfected survival on impossible odds, subscribe and join the families choosing security over status. Because some truths are timeless, some methods never stop working, and some battles are still worth fighting. One envelope, one meal plan, one conscious choice at a time.